Welcome to Strategy Talk, where the authors and editors discuss news and events with a splash of history. Our host today is Dan Masterson. Joining him is Jim Dunnigan, well-known military author and the Dean of Wargaming. Also, joining today's show is columnist and author retired Colonel Austin Bay.
Jim, the Ukraine-Russian war has turned into a cottage industry for the Ukrainians. The civilians have been involved in a lot of what's going on there. What are some of those things?
Well, the people's war in Ukraine has been there from the beginning. Initially, there wasn't much besides the People's War. A lot of the people who stopped the original Russian offensive were just ordinary citizens. They were grabbing whatever they could. They were building their own UAVs. They basically passed out weapons in Kiev. Anybody who was willing to go and face the orcs, as the Ukrainians lovingly call their Russian opponents, was armed. And so for those first few months, it was literally a people's war. This continued after the initial, the stages of the war. Eventually, a lot of these the people volunteers became part of the Ukrainian military. The NATO military aid started pouring in, and they were better armed and equipped. But they still play a role. The cell phones and satellite phones, and now Starlink terminals, which are all over Ukraine, there's thousands of them. They're manned, so to speak, by ordinary, Ukrainians, and they report to the Ukrainian military headquarters. The military headquarters set up a central, clearinghouse for individual Ukrainians citing something. In fact, early on, the deal was Ukrainians simply pointed their cell phone at an incoming Russian, those slow Iranian Shahed, cruise missiles, and clicked it, and that went right back to the Central Air Defense. And the Ukrainians are quick. I mean, they're on the defense. They're fighting for their nation. They put together an app which basically centralized the air defense systems, and they were immediately able to pick off most of those incoming Russian cruise missiles before they did any damage. And they're still doing that. I mean, the Russians have come up with new jamming techniques, new jamming equipment, but the Ukrainians have found a way around that. It's a constant, push and pull. Ukrainians come up with some new weapon. Russians come up with some new countermeasure like jamming, and then there's counter jamming, and there's systems that don't rely on jamming. So far, though, the Ukrainians are on top. They can't afford not to be.
Austin, what have you learned about what the civilians in Ukraine are doing?
Well, Jim's discussed some of their immediate tactical contributions. We've had 3 or 4 in-depth reports on civilian participation in Ukraine since February 2022, and I've done a few columns writing about nations in arms, and Ukraine instantaneously demonstrated that it had the individual will, collective individual will, to resist the Russians, and they did. They behaved like, Finland, 1940, 41. Individuals, soldiers. Finland also had army units, but Finns with rifles taking a pot shot as Russian troops entered Finnish territory, and stymied Stalin's initial offensives. Israel is a classic example of a nation in arms. Everybody in some way is in the reserves, and people have automatic weapons at home. That's a Swiss model. The Swiss have still a national service requirement. Everybody, all males, up until used to be age 65 and maybe age 60 now. I stand corrected on that, but they have an automatic rifle at home that gets checked every year by someone from the defense ministry. Make sure you have it. Make sure you have rounds for it. Make sure you're also keeping it where it can't be stolen. And then South Korea, for all functional purposes, is another nation in arms. The whole northern 2/3 of the country is a linked bunker system and has area defense capabilities, very similar to the way the Finns structure their defense. That if something gets cut off, they've got supplies and medical supplies, medical facilities within a defensive zone. Now, Finland's prepared, Israel, South Korea, Switzerland, Ukraine was in 2022 compared to what it was in 2014 because it had 8 years of that slow war, creeping war, the quote unquote hybrid war, but it sure looked like any typical dirty war in the Donbass. This was after Putin's forces seized Crimea in February, March of 2014, and then really it was April and May that they entered the Donbass region. So Ukraine had 8 years of slow war, which go about providing training, providing weapons. But the thing is the people wanted them. The people wanted to, were ready to fight. They weren't going to slip under the Russian heel. And remember, even in 2014, the USSR fell apart at the end of 1991. Everybody who was 23 years old and younger in 1914, they hadn't been part of the Soviet Union. They'd been part of the Ukrainian state. So to get back to some of the things that were in that recent report that Jim had on Ukrainian civilian participation, not only have they done it with their individual weapons and then done it collectively in groups and local defense forces, they've been creative, as he says, using homemade drones to knock out Russian vehicles. And they've also, and I think Jim alluded to this, Ukrainians, because of ubiquitous cell phones and the like, are when they see a cruise missile or one of the slower drones come over, they report it. It's very similar to the British during the Blitz with their air warden system. People would be calling on the telephone, sometimes with radio telephones, but they had a linked system where it wasn't just radar and it wasn't just other early warning aircraft. They had civilians linked in to say, yes, the Luftwaffe just flew over my head, and that's very useful intelligence for, in the case of the RAF, setting up interceptors. That's still useful intelligence now when you're meeting a swarming Russian attack, a mix of cruise missiles and drones. Something is coming in visually identified by a reliable civilian source, no longer really a civilian resistance fighter, that is on the way. And credit the Ukrainian Defense Ministry and the government with trusting this, developing it, encouraging it, in some ways professionalizing it. And you're seeing what a nation in arms can do to even resist a would-be superpower.
Another advantage they have, the U.S. shares satellite photos of Russia with the Ukrainians so they can find targets and confirm if they've been destroyed by these long-range UAV attacks. Now, the interesting thing is, and the Russians were upset about this in Moscow and St. Petersburg, when they were hit, when the attacks were made by these UAVs, close to the city center. And they thought, well, where's our air defenses? The thing is, the Russians haven't got air defenses against, UAVs. The UAVs haven't got enough metal. They're difficult to spot on radar, and they can fly low under the radar, as it were. So these are a new air weapon which never existed before. I mean, they have no crews, so you're not putting a lot of, airmen at risk. The only thing they're being operated by people, hundreds of kilometers away, and a lot of them can be programmed in order to avoid the jamming, to simply go to a specific location, sometimes using optical homing systems, where you can't jam it when it spots the picture it has in its memory. This is the old fire and forget system that's been used for years in anti-tank missiles. When it finally spots the target, it goes in. No amount of jamming is going to stop it because it can't be jammed. They've also developed INS, that's the inertial navigation systems, that is the backup for GPS, to become the primary operating system. Again, when they get close enough to the target, the terminal guidance system, which again is based on an optical device, goes in. So it's a constant back and forth. The Russians really have no defense except for smoke. There's good old smoke. The Russians have basically, returned to the past to defeat some of these future weapons. These weapons, depending upon optical acquisition of the target, if you basically set off a lot of smoke around the target area, it's not going to find it. So it's a constant back and forth. So far, the Russians are getting the worst of it. And now, Putin's been talking about peace talks, which is always a sign that, maybe it's time to give things up. The Ukrainians said, sure, give us back all the territory you're occupying, including the Crimea. And Putin basically, I don't believe he's responded yet. But Russians are in bad shape. They've lost over 500,000 troops, killed and permanently disabled. They've lost all their modern tanks. They're turning out new ones, but they're having difficulty getting the electronic components for the optics, for the add-ons. They have the capacity to build the tank hull, go for a new T-72B3, that's their favorite model. But if they want to equip it with, imaging, heat imaging devices and all matter of, uninterruptible radios, they can't use Starlink, which has been a big boon to the Elon Musk, SpaceX. He sent thousands of these Starlink terminals to Ukraine, and they're all over the place, and they can basically create a network, like a Wi-Fi network, wherever they're set up. So the Ukrainians have plenty of communications which the Russians don't have, and it hurts them. In fact, recently there was a disruption in the Starlink service to a part of Ukraine. I forget what it was caused by. I think it was just a glitch, in orbit, where he's got, almost 6,000 Starlink satellites circling the globe. But they quickly fixed it. But they realized how vulnerable, how dependent they were on the Starlink. Without the Starlink, they couldn't coordinate their attacks. They couldn't find out who was where and what they were doing. And it was a sharp reminder about how important, Starlink had become. Russians have nothing like it. The Russians tried to, get, black market Starlink terminals, but the minute the Russians, the Starlink discovered a Starlink terminal firing up inside Russia, they would shut it down selectively. See, SpaceX has been very quick to fix things. Unlike a government bureaucracy, which can take months, Starlink can take hours, minutes in some cases. You got a problem with that? Well, let me check. Boom, 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 fixed, and they're off. So the modern technology and the NATO support has managed to defeat the Russians. I mean, they are literally being defeated. Like I say, Putin was talking peace talks. He doesn't want to give up Crimea and the Donbass. But if he wants to stop this war, which is killing him economically, the sanctions, he's not able to sell his oil. He's got to sell it at a big discount, so he's losing revenue. And they've lost so many people. The Russians are protesting. I mean, he always depended on the fact that the Russians are stoic. They'll endure horrendous casualties. But that was World War II, where Russia was being invaded. It's different when Russia is the invader, and Putin's finding that out. He's lost popular support. People are wondering, why are we invading a local country and they're beating us? National pride be damned. Get us the hell out of there, Vladimir. And he's looking for a way out. And Ukraine says, yeah, give us all our territory back and we're done. But so far, No response.
So one of the things, Austin, I read about is that the support that is coming from the civilian population, from the standpoint of, what would normally be done by military people or by the industrial complex, is that they're actually doing repairs in their basement of different parts and like that. They're using their 3D printers to come up with stuff. This is something that's really unprecedented, right?
Well, Dan, I'm not sure it's unprecedented. I'll tell you, there are analogs to this, and this is and resistance operations. We think classically about the French in World War II, but this applies to called guerrilla or national resistance operations. I think really since the early 19th century, with the ability to make high explosives in your own basement, and even terrorist groups like the anarchists of the last 30 years and of the 19th century and the first 10 of the 20th century. In other words, home cooking, homemade weapons. Irish Republican Army also engaged in that, and to some degree, it's new to be able to make a drone in your own basement. That is, but the thing is, you're making a homemade weapon, and you have the skills to use it. You have the desire to use it. And in the case of the Ukrainians, they've got all their neighbors, their government, their own defense ministry. They're being encouraged to do it. So, it's a new wrinkle in that you can build your own Air Force, and I'll put it this way, your own Air Force in your basement. But the will to resist and the creativity to come up with weapons using what you've got on hand, that isn't new. We're just hearing about it in near real time because one of the other things that the Ukrainian civilians supply to their war effort is, I talked about seeing cruise missiles and drones flying overhead, is very, very detailed, highly granular intelligence about what's around them, and they do it on a cell phone. Early on, I'm thinking of March and April of 2022, the Russians started losing men because a Ukrainian would take a cell photo on a cell phone, take a photo, send it back to the defense ministry, and they started collapsing the time it took to respond to it. So sometimes it took 24 hours, but you knew that there was a Russian headquarters at this spot, and they'd attack it. But then they got down to where their sensor target system, the civilian with a cell phone, and sometimes they'd be able to do it in under 30 minutes. They have certainly now with their artillery and their HIMARS, and they're not artillery observers out front. It's not within, quote unquote, the strictly military system. It's civilians providing the intelligence. Of course, it goes to a fire direction center of sorts, and sometimes as I understand it, Jim may know more about this than I do, but it goes back there, the place in Kiev and elsewhere, where the picture comes in, and then they send it to the best positioned tube artillery or rocket artillery or attack drone they've got to go after the target. Now, some of these are highly transient targets. They're a collection of 100 Russian infantrymen in one spot preparing for an attack. But then you've got really highly granular intelligence from civilians, and they live there. You're fighting. The Russians are the invaders, as Jim said, and they're among a hostile population. So no, I'm not. When I say that it's It's very interesting and creative what they're doing, but they're doing something that people who've been invaded or oppressed have done. Well, I would say they're done from time immemorial, but certainly with the high explosives and bombs for the last 250 years, a resistance effort.
Well, it's also been very quick for development on the American and the NATO side because they were in a war situation. I mean, American troops aren't getting killed, but it is wartime. There's not a lot of bureaucracy, and they've come up with things like in addition to warheads, where if the bomb or a missile is being blocked by jamming, it can switch automatically to home-on jamming. So it'll immediately go after the jammer. Now, these Russian jammers are not wide area. They're local area. So they're small targets. And you have a number of missiles and guide bombs coming in, and they're being jammed. Those bombs will take care of suppression of enemy air defenses, as the old saying goes. They'll quickly home on the jamming and get rid of the jammers, and so the following weapons aren't going to be interfered with. So the technology is rapidly evolving. As Austin pointed out, you're talking, days, maybe a month at most. But the Ukrainians, their lives are at stake. So speed, there's a need for speed. It's a matter of life or death.
Yeah, and there's one other thing too. There's certain weapon systems that now exist. Now, some of them have existed for 70 years, but like a 40 millimeter grenade, just the type that you would have an old M79 grenade launcher, Vietnam War era U.S. infantry weapon. But a grenade, small grenade of that size, which is not very heavy, not very large, doesn't have a lot of quote unquote killing power, but you can put it on one of these small drones and in rather unsophisticated way, so that the drone takes this small, but still it's small, but it's still lethal. It's a kill infantryman, and if you could get it down the hatch of an armored vehicle, it would kill the crew, destroy the armored vehicle or the like. Might even be strong enough. It's certainly take out a thin-skin vehicle, a truck or a Jeep if you hit the engine or the cab. But these things are, you provide those to the drone maker, the homemade drone maker, and you've got a small attack aircraft, strike aircraft. And there are other weapons like that are being used, some specifically designed explosives. But I'm just pulling that out as an example of something that you take a rather short range grenade, small grenade, and drop it from overhead from 200 feet from a drone like that, and you've got a strike aircraft.
Yeah, the Ukrainians actually had improvised that early in the war, and some of the earliest reports were that using these quadcopters, these DJI quadcopters, and they just rigged. I mean, you can rig them with all sorts of stuff, but some of them were rigged to, as Austin pointed out, to carry a small grenade, especially those 50 caliber, and they would fly over and find troops and kill them. And there's been videos recently released by the Ukrainians of Russian troops fleeing in terror to get looking for the underbrush because the drones were coming for them. And they knew the drones would find them and drop a bomb on them and kill or wound them. And that's why the Russian infantry has taken such heavy casualties. And now they're demoralized. I mean, the Russians simply can't get troops. And that's why, again, Putin is talking about, well, let's end this. And, of course, he can do it. All he has to do is give up Crimea and the Donbass. He may end up doing that because the Russians have got themselves in the briar patch, as it were, and they can't get out unless the Ukrainians, help them out.
Yeah. So I guess one of the things that I read was that the Ukrainians are going through something like 10,000 UAVs a month.
Yes.
And,
the plan was to build a million in in 2024. But apparently they're exceeding that, considering the number that they've been using. And a lot of them are these one-way attack UAVs. And again, their guidance systems are becoming more and more sophisticated. It's another cottage industry. It's upgrading existing UAVs that haven't been used yet with more, more, how should I put it, useful guidance systems like this optical, target, aim at the target using an optical device. And you're right. The Ukrainian population, they have hundreds of individuals, small groups, and what have you, that the government can call on to make these modifications, and it certainly gets done a lot faster than being done in the factory. And the Russians did indeed go after Ukrainian factories that were doing the manufacturing, but they certainly can't go over after the thousands of homes and garages and barns that the Ukrainians are now using. So they dispersed their targets and made them impossible to attack decisively. And like I say, the Russians are now largely on the defense. They haven't got much offensive capability. They took an enormous beating, in the end of 1923 when the Ukrainians carried out those long-range UAV attacks, again, under the radar, and basically took out most of the oil refining and oil storage sites in Western Russia. And that had one interesting impact that had. The Russian troops in Ukraine were running out of fuel because the supplies in Russia were non-existent for a while. The Russians responded to that and what have you, but as long as the Ukrainians get the first shot in, the Russian recovery doesn't even things out. And the Ukrainians are continually getting the first shot in again and again and again.
Well, hopefully this all wraps up soon and they can get on with rebuilding their nations. So we will talk to you gentlemen next time.
All right, in 2 weeks. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Take care, guys. Bye.